Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion. I'm Danelle Swaim. I'm the marketing lead for North America at F1000 Research. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to bring you this panel discussion. How can the growth of open science contribute to your research development efforts? Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know that we are recording today's session, and the video and the slides will be available for later viewing after the event as well. Before we get started, here's how the webinar will run. Dr. Eck will be moderating today's discussion, but there will also be time for an interactive Q&A session later on in the webinar. At that time, we'll allow you to raise your hand to ask a question, or any of the panelists, you can ask of them, but you can also type your question in the chat box as you think of them, and then we will read those as well. So let me introduce our guests. You all know our moderator, Dr. Eck. She is the current president of NORDP and the associate vice president for research at Emory University. Dr. Eck earned her Doctor of Philosophy in Epidemiology from SUNY Albany, her Master of Public Health in Epidemiology and Behavioral Science at St. Louis University, and her Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology and Anthropology from the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Robert Kruse is also with us. He's a physician scientist at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in the Department of Pathology, where he researches point-of-care diagnostics in addition to his clinical duties. Dr. Kruse is a graduate of Baylor College of Medicine, where he obtained both his MD and PhD degrees. Dr. Brad Fenwick is the Senior Vice President, Open Science and Innovation at Taylor and Francis Group, the parent company of F1000 Research, and an award-winning scientist, academic, and government administrator, private sector executive, and leader in science policy globally. Dr. Fenwick holds a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine, Masters of Pathology, and PhD in Comparative Pathology. And finally, Jamie Burns is a senior research analyst on the competitive intelligence team within research development at Arizona State University. Jamie is certified in CI from the Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professional Organization and holds a master's in public administration from Columbia University. So with those introductions done, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Eck.
Hey, thank you so much. So huge thank you to F1000 Research for sponsoring some of these webinars, as well as sponsoring our conference. So many of you joined us at our conference last week, over 700 attendees, our largest ever. And I heard great feedback from lots of people about the virtual platform. So you got hours and hours and hours of NORDP content live. You're going back and viewing it now that you have lots of free time, and you're here for more, which is awesome. So I'm so glad that you're able to join us today. If you joined us in March for our first session, we talked a lot about just what is open science. And that presentation really kind of culminated with this point of, and why should research development professionals care about this? You know, how does it relate to the field of research development? And some of the key takeaways that have stuck with me since that first presentation where we started to talk about open science and F1000 Research were about how we increase recognition for faculty on our campuses. Those increased citation rates, increased use of data, and citations in the field are so important when we're talking about faculty being recognized. And so that's what we want to explore a little bit more today. They're really looking at a deeper dive of the relevance of open science to research development. And so you can feel free to ask questions as we go along here, and we'll be peppering them in. But what I'm going to do now is invite our panelists to share some of their thoughts about this their initial thoughts on, really how can open science contribute to research development, and focusing on that interface. And so Brad, I'm going to start with you because I think you can give us that really bigger picture of what we should be thinking out at this interface?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome everybody else from attending. Get this adjusted. The overview is that this caused me to reflect on the point that research development is now coming up on almost being 20 years old from its initial start, and that the research development professionals have had a history over that period of time of looking for new, creative, and innovative ways to make their researchers more competitive. And I've always been extremely impressed about how the research development professionals that have worked with me stay attuned to some of the most recent developments and promote those to the faculty in their efforts to secure extramural funding. They have a fundamental criteria of their success to evolve, to adapt, look for new creative ways of approaching things that have been going on for lots of time, a great deal of time. And open science is trending. It is moving in that direction of being something that could distinguish individual researchers or institutions and provide a bit of a competitive advantage. What I've seen is, and we all know, research is competitive but not hyper competitive. And some of you may know there's been a dramatic uptick in the number of applications recently going into our federal agencies, making it even more competitive. So open science is one of those things that as you learn about it, and as I have learned about it, I believe can provide something that funders are looking for in ways to distinguish your proposals and ongoing research in a fashion that will make you more competitive.
Thank you, Brad, for sharing that. And so, Robert, I want to turn to you next because, I just want to get a little bit of a kind of a sneak peek from your perspective, because you're a researcher who's benefited from having your science be open to an extent, right? And so would you tell us a little bit about just kind of give us your introductory perspective on how open science can benefit researchers like yourself?
Thanks, Kim. So I was lucky to publish on the F1000 platform early on during the pandemic, actually last January. Among the many reasons I chose it was the fact that it would be fastest to get online and share. So the traditional publication process, you submit it to a journal, you might hear back in a month, it's going to go to review, and then maybe a month or two review, and then you'll edit the paper another couple of months, and then maybe it's online 6, 8, 12 months later. And that's not certainly feasible in a pandemic setting, but frankly, for most researchers' careers, it's also not very feasible. People need papers out for promotions, to help with their grant applications. You can cite something. So I would say, in a way, F1000 is kind of on the cutting edge, since they've had this model for a few years now where you can actually just put your paper on, and then all the peer review happens on the website, and you can actually read the peer review, and then you respond and update your manuscript live. And then once it's accepted by peer review, then it's automatically uploaded onto PubMed. So all this is much faster. I would say the pandemic has really accelerated these open science trends. So most people now do something similar, which is put papers on preprint servers. And that's another thing I've done, where you put on preprint server, so the work is already out there. You're getting feedback informally really on social media even, where other people are reading it, and then you can update your paper and kind of when it's being under revision, and then it'll finally come out. So I would say looking at the kind of the open science piece, frankly, these journals charge a lot to actually read articles. So when you think about other countries, particularly, they will not have access to as many articles as you might at a big university. And so that certainly helps the citation count, where people can actually read your article simply enough. And then I think another kind of just big trend is people want to promote people based on other metrics rather than the name of the journal or the impact factor of the journal. So if you can actually show page views, retweets, page views, these are these new type of metrics to track open science. Ultimately, it just leads to more engagement with other collaborators, and then more, hopefully, contribution to overall science. And certainly it can help you get more grant money, which is what we all want to help our research.
Thanks, Robert. You bring up some really compelling points. So I want to invite Jamie to do a little introduction here. Jamie really being part of the on-the-ground research development network at ASU. And Jamie, what are you seeing, just some high-level takeaways to introduce to the group as we get into our discussion today? What are you seeing at this interface of open science and research development? You're muted, I think.
Thank you. The biggest thing I'm seeing is that open science policies are, growing in their adoption, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us as research development professionals. And so I work on our competitive intelligence team at ASU, and what open science really allows us to do is look across the landscape of research and get a very in-depth view of what's going on. And so that's really beneficial to our researchers because we can help them identify collaborators. We can also, as Brad mentioned earlier, funding is very competitive. And so we can help and start to identify who are those competitors. So I think as research development professionals, open science gives us a lot of opportunity to help our faculty and our overall institutions be really strategic in how they're thinking about what other universities are doing, what other faculty research is occurring across really the globe. And so I think that's the biggest area for opportunity for RD professionals.
Wow, thank you. And so we're going to hear more about that as we continue our conversation today. So now I want to turn to a question and really get your answers on specifically, if somebody came up to you, a research development professional, and said, why should research development care about open science? Now, this is kind of honing in and refining some of your opening remarks, but why should a research development professional care about open science? So, Brad, I'm going to ask you to take that first, and then I'll ask Jamie.
It's a good question, and I think it is sort of at the core of our webinar today, is that if, as research professionals, you're trying to help your faculty distinguish themselves, having served on lots of review panels, the difference between those that get funding and those that do not are often just razor thin. So the idea of preparing proposals or helping faculty adopt the principles of open science that's appropriate for their discipline, I think will help showcase their ability as scientists, including the methods and the procedures and the data analytics and the whole process of science, as opposed to just the end product of the publication or the final results or a graph. We all know that if you're going to be successful in winning proposals, you need to have preliminary data. And you have to have previous high quality publications. By being able to demonstrate to the review teams that you do that, but you also are transparent in terms of how you go about that process, so that they can examine or others can be guided to reproduce your work, by providing all of those details in terms of the research process that the PI has undertaken previously and is committing to undertake in the proposal they're submitting at that time.
Thanks, Brad. And so, Jamie, what about you? When you think about if a research development professional came up to you at conference next year and said, why should I care about open science? You know, what would be that core answer that you gave?
Yeah, so there's 3 broad reasons RD professionals should care about open science. And the first is it's important to faculty, right? There's so many benefits of open science for researchers, and as RD professionals, we of course want to be sure that those benefits are realized for the faculty at our institutions. And then secondly, because it's important to sponsors. Sponsors are, growing in their adoption of these policies, and crucial to our RD work is helping faculty navigate, understand, and respond to sponsor priorities. And then third, it's important to society and science overall. And I think that's incredibly important to us as RD professionals. So by highlighting the benefits of open science at our institutions, we're helping advance society. We can't know where the next breakthrough in research will come from, and we don't know who the next great innovator is. And I think the great things about open science is that it helps ensure equal access across all kinds of institutions of all various sizes. And so I think it allows for more diverse groups to be able to act on their ideas. And so in that sense, open science is right in line with our RD commitments to diversity as a part of NORDP and just overall commitments of our universities.
Wow, great points, Jamie. I mean, certainly many of our NORDP members and NORDP as an organization highly values diversity. I'm so glad that you brought that into the conversation. And I'll also add that, a part of what I started to learn about when I first really heard about open science was that in similar ways to certain methodologies like community-based participatory research, for example, CBPR, there are some faculty members who not only do they do, my background's public health, not only do they do important public health work, but actually a part of their scholarship is around developing methodologies in CBPR, for example. And I think that I've seen corollaries on the open science side where faculty members are doing very interesting research and they're publishing about it and they're using open science, but then they're also focused on sort of expanding the methodology and the practice around open science as an additional area of scholarship. And I think that that's an important component for research development professionals to think about and be aware of, that it is an additional, almost cross-cutting way to think about scholarship too. So I want to move on. Well, before I do, let me remind everybody that we're happy to take questions in the chat as we're talking. We might work them in at the end, or maybe even work them in as we're having our panel discussion today, but feel free to drop those in anytime. And so now I want to talk about trends and the trends that you're seeing around open science and open research. And Jamie, I think that you've got some material to share with us today that'll be really enlightening.
Yes, I do have some slides. If Danelle could share, my slide 2 is on trends. Here we go. All right, so I want to highlight 2 broad trends, and first is that open science has been around for a while, but more recently there's been a growth in support and adoption of policies, and I'll walk through kind of what that's looked like and charting that a bit more on my next slide. But I also want to highlight that sponsors have really prioritized open science in the past few decades. They've moved from preferring open science in many cases to actually mandating it, mandating the sharing of articles and data. And so we've seen the adoption of open science policies from major sponsors, beginning with NIH in 2008, NSF 2011, all the way through kind of more recent times when we're seeing open science policies from NASA, DoD. And so it's clear to me that open science policies will likely continue to be prioritized by these sponsors. Additionally, many foundations have also implemented open science mandates. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is one that comes to mind as a large foundation moving forward open science. And so I think, as we continue to see these adoptions of policies, institutions that have and prioritize an open focus will be more in line with those sponsors. And then if you could go to the next slide, I'll highlight kind of exactly what the trends look like. There we go. So the chart that's on the screen is produced and maintained by the University of Southampton, and it's called the Registry of Open Access Repository Mandates and Policies, which long name, but Warmap is the acronym. And so this charts the growth of open science access and mandates and policies adopted by universities, research institutions, research funders. And so what you're seeing on the screen is actually a global overview, but Warmap itself, if you'd like to look at the United States specifically, their website's phenomenal, and they have some great data visualizations that offer a comparison by country, and so you can see that. But really, the takeaway from this chart is that open science has dramatically increased over the past few decades, and so research organizations are charted in the light blue, and so you can just see, just dramatic growth there. And then in the darker blue, it's a smaller subset, but you still can see the same trend line with research funders. And so I think overall, the overall trend shows that open science is growing, and institutions who have these policies and really work to create a culture around open science will likely benefit.
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, a huge trend there, right? So Robert, from your perspective, from the researcher's perspective, what do you see in terms of trends?
I think it's definitely only going to grow. I think even if you asked like 2 years ago if this idea of preprint, so preprint means sharing your work on a server even before peer review, it was, particularly in the biological sciences, kind of heresy. And now it's very ubiquitous. People want the credit for being first. And then frankly, a lot of the discussion already on social media is already generated from preprint. So I think definitely faster review. Most journals that I see are actually all switching to open science, kind of open access. That has pluses and minuses, particularly among the costs of publishing. But there is that expectation that people know that open access articles are cited more. That's been published in many things. So people need more citations. That will certainly help as far as people are promoted, their metrics, H-index, which is a kind of a metric of how many times you've been cited. So I think as these things kind of filter through the system, open science will continue to grow. I think more and more journals will probably stop their paywalls, and they'll all be essentially open access. I think really where kind of the next trend is like, how do researchers leverage this? I think there's still a lot of a gap in knowledge on how to share your work, particularly on social media, LinkedIn, how to write about it to get that engagement. That's still something that's very unfamiliar to people, but certainly I can follow some of the people who are very successful, and I'm sure that only helps them get more grants because more people know who they are at these grant review meetings, and certainly sponsors find them. So sponsors, like Jamie was saying, are online, they're seeing what's being shared, and then they'll reach out to you. So in some ways, you're kind of like skipping this traditional process where only a limited number of people even know what the grant opportunities were, and now they're almost finding the researchers already. So it's kind of a more, maybe it's more democratic, maybe it's not, but certainly more of an open age where you're selling yourself and your brand, if you will, in addition to selling your science. So and I think that's something where maybe some of these R&D professionals can help, because it's certainly not a skill many faculty actually have.
Wow, Robert. So I didn't realize that you were such a futurist. All the journals are going to stop their paywalls and make everything open. It's a good vision. Do you tweet? That interface between social media and open science, is really interesting too. Do you tweet your abstract one line at a time over the course of a few days, or how do you engage with it?
I haven't done this yet, although I've seen a lot of good ones, and I'm trying to like understand. I'm not like a social media guru yet, but a lot of people will do what's called a tweetorial. So they'll do maybe like a thread of 5 or 6 posts. Well, they'll explain the gist of their paper, and they'll like have screenshots of the important figures. So it's definitely not sharing, you know, line by line the exact, because they're trying to have like kind of a lay audience version, but more of like a broad scientist version. So it definitely helps share work, because otherwise no, the average person's not going on PubMed and finding something. So certainly it helps the engagement, trying to present things. And even in a way, you see journals now a lot require images as abstracts, and those can be easily shared and people can look at it. Also, a lot of journals now are trying to do video abstracts. And so all these are things that, you know, like even a few years ago would have been like crazy, but now people like want to see them because they're easily shareable. And this is not even the paper, you know, some people might just watch the video and that's it.
Yeah, thanks for adding a little bit to that. So Brad, our unofficial NORDP historian has corrected our estimate of how long research development has existed. He says there's evidence for 35 years that it's existed. But so Brad, I want to invite you to, are there trends that we've missed in the responses that we've heard from Jamie or Robert that you want to highlight for this group?
The one trend is, and I agree with everything that's been said, speed to recognition is increasingly important. And it's moving to disciplines that I wouldn't have predicted would adopt it so quickly, particularly my own discipline, medicine, biological sciences, where the history is it's my data, keep your hands off. It has been the sort of principle, because that was your gold mine. But that's changed to be able to be much more transparent and demonstrate your capabilities as a scientist by actually providing much more detailed background evidence supporting the conclusions of your research in terms of data archives and data accessibility and the algorithms that were used to interrogate that data, as well as procedures and methods that were used. I love the comment that we're moving to YouTube and video. If I was out running a lab again, I probably would post videos of our techniques as opposed to write them. Writing them was pretty laborious. And in fact, I edited a big journal, and it wasn't long ago that we were taking it seriously, maybe eliminating the materials and methods sections of our papers because they were just taking up space. But now we realize for integrity, for reproducibility, that kind of information is particularly critical. And it creates an opportunity to essentially demonstrate the caliber of scientist you are, as opposed to skimming over those and not including them as in the corpus of the work that resulted in the conclusions. So the trend I see is backing up that chain, being interested obviously in the conclusions and the outcomes of the research, but also an increasing trend about what was the process, techniques, line of thought, methods used to produce those results. And I think by researchers, again, appropriate for their discipline, including those in archives or in grant proposals, and in terms of shadowing back to those type of resources, just creates a tremendous amount of confidence in the reviewers for grants and then the editors for accepting papers. And on a sort of a personal point, yeah, I do accept papers that don't include that as supplemental information. But when the researchers spend the time to do that and as noted, are trained to do it well, my confidence that this is a good paper that deserves acceptance goes up quickly, and to be in fact, it gets accepted quicker with less reviews. And as a result, the researchers can claim that space and include it with some credibility in terms of grant proposals as prior work. Preprints are doing some of that, but I'd love to see, speed to publication and all the information in the corpus of work so it gets into the scientific record and is correctable and usable, as opposed to all of us relying on preprints as the only sort of solution to this.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, a huge paradigm shift over the past several years and how we think about sharing our data and many other components that you brought up. Thank you. So now I want to share.
And Kimberly, just let me add.
Yeah.
Kimberly, let me add a voice of confidence. I had not thought until you mentioned that there is scholarship in terms of how you go about this process. And it's that science of science type of thing. But some people do it well, some not so well. And if you try to do it and don't do it so well, it might actually backfire a bit. So being trained and getting the support from the research development professionals about what really works and how to put all that together, I think there's some scholarship in that as well. So great addition.
Yeah, thank you. So let's think more now about competitiveness and recognition, both at the institutional level and individual level, and how open science, we've introduced this concept that it can help with recognition and competitiveness, but I want to hear a little bit more. And let's start from Robert, from your experience. You'll walk us down that path and what open science really meant to you and the results that you saw in terms of recognition and competitiveness.
I think it certainly builds more connections that are kind of unexpected, especially having something that's out there in the public, no paywall, people can see it quickly. And then if you're lucky, it can start being shared on social media. I would say Google search can kind of help, but it's definitely helpful when people are like retweeting a link or sharing links on these platforms. Because I mean, the beauty of it is people will contact you all over the world. I definitely, for the article on the screen, was finding people in China and like South America, Europe, Canada. So you definitely build a lot more connections outside your normal social network than you'd otherwise expect. People will actually read it and email you, which is surprisingly somewhat uncommon in research. People have some phobia with emailing the authors of the work, but so that was kind of nice to see and get feedback. So I think just kind of, like I said earlier, a lot of science, like a lot of our culture, for better or worse, is moving toward your brand and people seeing what you're publishing and kind of reaching out and more interactions with everyone. So the more that can happen, and certainly that happened in my case, I think the better. And then certainly on a logistical side, like these metrics do matter. So having more citations do help in like promotion, your stats. These are things that people look at when you're trying to go from assistant, associate, full professor. So yeah, and hopefully leading to more grant funding as well.
Thanks, Robert. Another plug for that interface with social media. You know, I sense a lot of wheels turning in our attendees today, thinking about how can they partner with their central comms to do a different kind of media training for researchers. You know, everyone has taken that note down now. So Jamie, let me turn to you next. Competitiveness, you know, that's your middle name, right? So talk to us about competitiveness in open science and what you're seeing there.
Sure. So as we've mentioned, right, increased visibility and usage. And so, the open science publications are cited more frequently, which is of course great for faculty and their competitiveness, as we've touched on today. I also think we've talked about this a little bit, but greater trust in the publications, that's of course really great for institutional branding. We see that when kind of all parts of the research process are opened up, there's more trust in the outcomes. And I think that's really great for our institution's branding and our faculty's branding. And then, so where I really think as RD professionals, we can have the biggest impact and opportunity for helping our faculty increase their competitiveness is around landscape scanning. And so as a CI professional, I'm frequently asked to detail who at ASU and beyond ASU's campus is an expert in a particular research area. And so when I do that, it's called a landscape analysis. And so I'm looking at other institutions to see what kind of research they're doing and who exactly is doing the research and excelling, what exactly are the details of what they're doing. And so this, of course, helps highlight competitors and proposal strategies for our ASU's faculty, but it also helps highlight potential collaborators. And so I think open science is not only beneficial for the sharing of research, but for us in RD in tracking expertise. And that's where we can really help our faculty, by knowing in depth who's conducting research on a particular topic. Collaborations can be so much more strategic. Proposals can be so much more competitive and strategic. And so I think, open science just broadens the number of possible collaborators, broadens the positioning we can help our faculty with in their proposals. And it just really opens up just a realm of possibilities for us as research development professionals in tracking what's going on in a particular research area.
Thanks, Jamie. And so if you have not previously perused ASU's site around competitive intelligence, Jamie has this really awesome chart where she describes not only what it goes into a landscape analysis, which she was just speaking to today, but then has several other types of reports and reviews that she can prepare for all different things. Totally worth going and checking out the next time you've got 5 minutes before your next Zoom meeting. Very interesting. And Jamie, if people wanted to learn a little bit more about your approach to competitive intelligence, I know you've presented at several NORDP conferences. Do you just want to give a couple minutes about that overall approach and how you do it at ASU?
Sure. So competitive intelligence really got started in industry. And so pretty much everything we do at ASU, we are all industry certified, which is great, but we've had to adopt those practices to academia because we do function differently than industry, where we don't only see other universities as competitors, but also collaborators. So that's a nuance. And so, at ASU, we're looking at things like capacity. Where do we have strength? Where is there opportunity for growth based on what's happening federally? What research areas are growing? How can we start to match those research areas at our institution by leveraging multiple disciplines across our campus? Also looking at particular programs. And so, we're always trying to help faculty with proposals. And so as they go and apply to different programs from various sponsors, we'll look at the trends in those programs to see what's been funded in the past, what might they want to fund in the future, to get an overview of what's working in this program and what's missing in the program. And there's some opportunities, for faculty at both ends of that. And then we'll also look at really just strategy overall. And so those are my favorite projects, our strategic projects, where we're really answering big picture questions for our institution around how to strategically grow research. I will also note that if you're interested in learning more about competitive intelligence, we do have a competitive intelligence working group that meets throughout the academic year, about 6 to 8 webinars a year, where we really dive into different topics in CI and just have great discussion around what CI looks like in academia. So if you're interested in that, feel free to email me and I can get you on the listserv and get you all set up.
Awesome. Thanks. Great. I'm so glad you shared a little bit more about that and plugged that group. I think a lot of the folks on the call would be very interested. So we're gonna move to our final question now with our panelists, and that's really future oriented. And I'll remind attendees, happy to take your questions then. So thinking about 5-10 years in the future, what does the research ecosystem look like? And Brad, I'll start with you to give that really big picture overview.
Well, a number of things that have been mentioned today, I think, are foreshadowing what the future will look like. Where individual papers stand on their own, because we have paper-specific metrics that we didn't have before. The value of publishing in an individual journal will erode. It was part of the credibility of the paper when we had journal-specific metrics, but now that we have paper-specific metrics, the paper itself is the unit of production and the unit of recognition. The metrics supporting that, I think, will be becoming increasingly important. And one that I'm particularly excited about and been promoting, that it becomes a dominant criteria, are downloads or usages, because that reflects the public consumption of our science. There's only going to be a very small number of individuals that will actually make the effort to actually cite your work, but there may be literally tens of thousands of people in organizations that will consume your research and have an impact on their lives. And they will use that in the various ways that are appropriate. That is the recognition of research impact at the institutional and individual level. And if you're looking to be competitive for funding, impact is becoming that next sort of pillar in terms of, being fundable. Perhaps not in 5 years, but I think relatively soon. This interesting sort of phenomena of applying for funding and going through that process, which we all know can take months and months and months to do. I think our funders, as I was able to do a bit as a chief scientist, will take on the challenge of actually reaching out and funding somebody directly. Saying, you are doing great work. We have a history, we've kept an eye on you. We need some solution or some progress in this area. Are you willing to undertake that? It may still be a bit competitive, or there may be 2 or 3 they're considering, but it's very much more of a project-oriented type thing. And I got to tell you, that's pretty exciting. Just a personal anecdote, I got off the stage after giving a presentation, and this person walks up and says, and asks the most uninformed question I've ever gotten: do you have enough money to support your research? Yeah, the answer, of course, was no, but I'm going to write a grant. And then he said, I don't want you to spend your time writing a grant. I want to have you spend your time doing research. I'll give you the money. And that trend of we're speeding up scientists, I think the funding bodies will also speed up, or need to speed up, their decision making and their distribution of resources to keep up. How will they do that? Well, the metrics that Jamie mentioned and progress and transparency, I think, will help raise the criteria there. I also really like the idea of almost going back to the future, where by doing this, researchers get collaborators around the world that they might not otherwise have an opportunity to interact with. It's back to the old, when we actually sent reprints of our journal articles out around the world by snail mail. And when you got a request for somebody interested in your paper you knew that could be a potential collaborator. And you could reach out to them in turn to see if there was a collaborative possibility related to the research. And those sort of cold connections warm up very quickly in terms of being able to do the type of science that is difficult to do on your own.
Wow, a great vision for the future. Jamie, do you have anything to add to that?
I would second it all. I think that's a great vision for the future. I guess as RD professionals, how do we help get to that future is kind of what I'm thinking. And so I think first and foremost, we do what we're doing here today, discuss open science. And I think more importantly, bringing these conversations back to our institutions. I think as RD professionals, we're somewhat uniquely positioned to highlight, institutional and societal benefits while also taking stock of how policies impact and benefit our faculty. And so I think as we move into the future that Brad has just painted, and I hope that's the future we move to, that, I think it's important we continue these kinds of conversations and helping get there.
And Robert, what about you? Do you have anything to add to this vision for the future?
I think Brad did a great job of highlighting, I think a lot of trends are being discussed. I hope we get there. I think one thing in order for us to get there to like paper-centered metrics and attribution, which I agree, especially with the thousands of journals now, I know even when I'm trying to figure out what journal to submit to, it's not very apparent which one's better or not. So really what matters is getting it out and getting the engagement. I think we'll definitely need a system of somehow unifying all these metrics. Like you see some on the screen with views, downloads, somehow all the journals can share this information and try to then accumulate it so that it can be on a CV. Clearly, like there needs to be a culture change among the system, because it's definitely a Darwinian system. So if you tell people you will succeed if you accomplish, 1,000-page citations this year, then people will go for that. But if you're rewarding it based on publish in this journal, and then I'll, reward you, people will search for that. So it needs to be some type of nexus of, okay, we will try to have more paid citations. I think to a certain extent, what Brad mentioned about direct funding could try to break the system, because right now the old school people, frankly, are on the grant panels and they're deciding based on these old metrics. So if you have funders, particularly nonprofits who are outside of the NIH system or the NCI or the National Science Foundation, maybe they value these other metrics better and the field will shift. So I think the only other possible big trend that I'm curious will happen is open peer review. Clearly F1000 does that. And then I see more and more journals starting to offer it, particularly when I review papers, they'll ask if you want to be your name out there. And frankly, I haven't done that. And I think most people haven't done that. And that still needs to be a culture trend. Frankly, the reason no one does it still is the politics of being on record for criticizing someone. You don't know if that person will stab your back at the next, grant meeting. So no one does it. That said, though, I think frankly, it'd be a good thing if it did happen, because I think the quality of the reviews would go up. There would be less pity comments, less frankly nonsensical things, or less. It would kind of expose a bit more of the system, and I think the quality of peer review might go up, particularly if everyone knows this paper came out that's now retracted. Who were the grant reviewers, and people can ask them. So and so maybe it'll make science better, but I don't know if that will happen or not. I hope it does. It certainly change the discourse around science. But that's the only other trend. I think Brad hit on all the other big ones.
Wow, thank you. So, a lot of change, a lot of potential discomfort, a lot of hope in your visions for the future. And, one thing that I'll add is that I think there's an opportunity over the next, let's say 10 years, there's an interface between open science and multidisciplinary collaboration. Most institutions still haven't figured out how to value, reward, and incentivize interdisciplinary collaboration, multidisciplinary collaboration in the promotion and tenure process. And so I think there's a way for open science to help move some of that conversation forward, because so often what I hear is the value for multidisciplinary work is sometimes lower because they don't know what the person individually contributed. And could open science help answer that question is something I'm thinking about for the future. So I want to turn now to we do have one question in the chat, and I'm going to direct it to Robert at first, and then invite others to weigh in as well. So the question that we received from one of our attendees today is about responding to faculty who, quote, don't have time for dealing with data and protocols necessary for open science, open practices. And there may be PIs who really avoid sort of the open science and that whole conversation because they are putting their time into quantity over dissemination and trying to get some of the views and trying to put all of the information really publicly available. So Robert, one of your colleagues who says, don't waste your time on that, or I'm not going to do that, what would you say to them?
I would say you have to follow where the trends are going, and I feel like the people who are more successful, because I think kind of what Brad touched on earlier, where you really can accelerate your funding is getting some of these incidental, like someone wants to fund you, a foundation wants to fund you, that's outside the traditional grant system. And, that's the fastest money. It's maybe easier money than we're going through the ringer of having a 6 month, 8 months, 20-person panel rejecting you to resubmit. And I feel like my impression is from following the news of other people engaged in this is that the more you're visible, the more you're getting this, kind of outside money. So maybe if you're in a niche space where there's only a very small number of people, everyone reads each other's papers, it doesn't matter. But if you want to really grow outside your space, find collaborators, as you said, across disciplines, I think this is the way to go. Certainly a lot of journals now are open access in the sense that you pay money for the entire article to be read. But I think where the R&D professionals can help is maybe, I don't know, either for the PI or teaching them how to really engage on all these other platforms to spread the work, which obviously is a very different skill set and something people aren't comfortable with, but something that needs to definitely grow. So, if you're not willing to do it, then at the very least, maybe you can solicit people to kind of help figure out how to disseminate it.
Mm-hmm. And then Brad, do you have anything to add to that? And I'll invite you as we come to the end of our hour here to share any sort of overarching takeaway thoughts you might have. That's you, Brad.
Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't. Little technical issue. So I missed your question, but let me guess. So you conduct science in terms of how you were trained to conduct science as a graduate student or as a postdoc. So I think it's incumbent on the best faculty and the best institutions to train their students in this new process, where it's just not the end that matters, it's also the process, as I mentioned before. The beauty is that now we can provide credit for a clever algorithm, for a clever way of archiving data, for a new procedure or process that generates valuable data. And those in themselves can be recognized with DOIs, can be published in journals, or even data sets now are published as essentially in certain journals, in certain places, and the individual get credit. So rather than getting credit for just one paper and one citation, now the process and all the various pieces that go in there can be given credit. It comes back to your point, Kimberly, that there may have been somebody on the research team that was the data guru. And just that piece of a paper in and of itself as a standalone could be also recognized, published, and be cited. That unpacks this process, and I think makes it more democratic for team science or interactive science. It also recognizes that the PI is the type of a leader that brings people together and marshals their best efforts to produce something that none of them individually could possibly do. And to me, that is a very powerful advancement. And getting individuals on campus to help faculty learn the process and make it less onerous through technology or experience, I think the research development professionals, I can't think of a better group to do that.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad. I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle to close out.
Thank you, and I just want to thank everyone for attending today. Our panelists, Dr. Fenwick, Dr. Kruse, Jamie, Dr. Eck. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure for us to be at the NORDP conference last week, and also a pleasure to bring this panel to you today. I hope you learned a lot. I know I certainly did. And I really appreciate everyone's thoughts and visions for the future. And so thank you all for attending. Any other questions or to get in contact with us to find out more about F1000, how we can help achieve your objectives as research development professionals, please be in contact. And you should have my email all from the invite. It's danelle.swaim@f1000.com. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.